our own agreeableness is masquerading as something compassionate and caring.
The way to do good work is not only the work itself is good, but the delivery and the process of delivering that work is good. Business is not simply making money or getting paid or issuing invoices or profit and loss statements, but it's little things that extend into every fiber of the business. Hello, Architect Nation, and welcome back. This is the right place for you if you run an architectural practice. And on today's episode of the Business of Architecture podcast, you'll discover how to create a high-performing team that takes accountability. On today's episode, some of what you'll learn is the tiny language signals that expose a lack of accountability on your team and the two-word shift that flips ownership on instantly. The compassion with fierceness model, how to hold team members and clients to account without guilt, shame, or any of those military vibes, using a simple 4-step collision conversation framework that creates trust. And the profit lever that no one measures, how true accountability moves you from supplier to trusted advisor with your clients, speeds up your decisions, helps make premium fees stick, and why 100% plus 100% beats 50-50 every time. And now a quick word from our sponsors, Gelt and World Teams.
Today's episode is sponsored by Gelt. Is your architecture firm just filing taxes or actually using them to grow the business? Gelt is your partner in optimizing your taxes so you can focus on scale. They work with you year-round, not just at tax time, taking a proactive approach that combines expert CPAs and powerful technology. From smart entity structures to overlook deductions and smarter compensation planning, Gelt helps architecture firms unlock strategies most accountants miss. And exclusively for Business of Architecture listeners, Gelt is offering 10% off your first year. Don't wait for next tax season. Schedule your complimentary consultation at joingelt.com. That's JOINGELT.com to learn more and mention BOA when you sign up. A while ago, we began to hear reports of a company that was helping some of our clients build remote teams. We looked into it more closely and discovered the company World Teams that was helping small architectural practitioners build remote teams that were both capable and qualified. We were intrigued by another business that are addressing one of the critical pain points for small architectural practices, which is the ability to grow and shrink a team effectively, to be able to handle higher workflow without having to staff up significantly, and also being very sensitive about labor cost. World Teams is built to address these issues. World Teams is a small but mighty company that helps architectural practices build high-performing remote teams quickly and efficiently, saving you the headache of sorting resumes and interviewing underqualified candidates. World Teams operates in your time zone and prioritizes near-native English speakers, ensuring clear and efficient communication with your remote team members. They have flexible contracts so you can adjust your team size as your needs evolve. Additionally, you're connected directly with your skilled professionals, which fosters trust and collaboration, and World Teams helps you reduce your operating cost without compromising the quality that's so important to a practice. To download a free guide for building a remote team for a small architectural practice, go to businessofarchitecture.com/World Teams. That's one word, businessofarchitecture.com/World Teams.
Hello, Architect Nation. I hope everyone is well here. We've got a great episode lined up for you today. Ryan Willard here, and I am sitting with the founder of the Business of Architecture, Enoch Sears. How are you, sir?
Ryan, great to be here as always. Looking forward to this powerful and crucial conversation.
Always one of my favorite parts of the week is when we get to sit down and talk a little bit about insights and powerful leadership strategies for running an architectural firm. So today we're going to talk about accountability. And this is one of the things that we see in architecture firms all the time, which is missing. And it has quite a large impact on a number of firms and architectural executions, if you like. And it's it could be quite a chronic problem, and it's more common than you might think. Okay, so the term accountability, sometimes it feels like it's a heavy term, or that there's going to be a lot of friction-based conversations. And we hear from a lot of leaders that they really struggle with having those difficult conversations with team members who are not performing, or even with clients who aren't behaving the way that they should be behaving, they're not paying, and with other leaders, with their partners in their firms, they're not holding each other accountable to things that they've said. Sometimes this can, we end up seeing this as an environment that creates a very weak and vulnerable place of work, which is filled with a lot of over agreeableness. And that ends up impacting a business's efficiency pretty much at every level, really, from individual team members to senior management from individual team members who are producing drawings to senior management who are meant to be producing the profit.
Yeah, this can really fester like a cancer in the organization. And one of the challenges is that it can often be invisible because lack of accountability. Let's go back and we'll define accountability here as we jump into it. That's probably a good place to start. Let's look at what actually is accountability. So the Merriam-Webster's dictionary says the quality or state of being accountable, which doesn't help too much. But then it goes on to say, especially an obligation or willingness to accept responsibility or to account for one's actions. So there's two elements here. One element is the acceptance of responsibility. And the second one is giving account for one's actions. What I did, the impacts of those actions. So when we look at willingness to accept responsibility, this means that the way accountability is communicated happens through language. It happens through the words that we use, which ultimately convey a reflection of how we see the situation and our energetic stance on that particular situation. So I thought it was really funny for those of our Latin American listeners who speak Spanish. The way that you say something fell in Spanish, or if you were to say I dropped something, typically I would say se cayó, right? So like el vaso se cayó, the glass fell. So it's it's interesting to see that in some other languages, when something happens, there's actually even like an indirect kind of action that happens. It's not like I fell or I made it fall or anything like that. It's like it fell. And so it comes back to language. So we can convey the accountability or not. Like earlier, we were having a conversation with our highly esteemed design council, and one of the members was not going to be able to make the design council event, which is happening. It's our live event that we have 3 to 4 times a year. And we're holding him to account for that. And as he was describing how it came about that he was going to miss the event, he said, well, the date ended up to be on, when I was taking vacation, ended up to be on the date of the event. Now it's a very passive way to talk about it instead of saying, I scheduled it this way, or, that would be the accountable version of that. I scheduled it that way. It is me being the person who did the action here. It's very loose and it's very ephemeral. Well, it ended up as if vacations just get randomly scheduled by themselves. So that's just one small example, but we see this thing. So those are some clues and look, we all do it. Like we all do it. There's probably not a human being on the planet who doesn't want to shirk responsibility or doesn't want to avoid accountability or kind of, avoid that uncomfortable situation. And I don't know how people's experience is of that. But what I know is that there's a part of me that wants to be a good boy, in quotes, and not a bad boy, in quotes, meaning I want to get approval. I want to have people validate me. I don't want to be cast off from the tribe, so to speak. In evolutionary terms, we as human beings evolved to be communal creatures, communal animals. And there's baked into our nervous system, there's a fear of displeasing others, because when we displease others, potentially we will get sidelined from the group and we'll lose resources. And so that's just been hardwired into us over time. So we have a couple of challenges as we look at this. Number one is it can be scary to accept responsibility. I remember when I was working in architectural practices, I would often hope that when I dropped balls or when I messed up things on the drawings, that it would go unnoticed. Not necessarily because I wanted to hide anything, but because I wanted to avoid the discomfort of being seen as having done something wrong. because I worried that if I did enough things that weren't up to standard or were wrong, I might lose my job. And it was really an approach that was based on a lot of fear. Now, also in the architecture firms where I worked, there wasn't a good culture around accountability. So there's two sides to every story, right? We can't just say, oh, it's the employees who aren't accountable. It's like, if the employees aren't being accountable, what's missing for you? Why have you not, as a leader, why have you not created a culture of accountability? And so it's too easy to look at, oh, my employees aren't doing this, or they're underperforming. And it's so frustrating, which is so important to realize that when we're getting triggered, when we're feeling these emotions of frustration or annoyance, this is pointing at something where our team members are not living up to a certain expectation we have. So that's the clue. That's the clue to dig deeper. And the clue is what helps us achieve higher performance, not out of a drive to grasp or not out of a drive to become something that, not because we need to gratify our sense of self, but simply because we already feel whole in ourselves and we're out to play a big game. So this is where you can have all sort of shadow elements can enter into this conversation of accountability. Sometimes when people are holding other people to account, they're coming from a place of ego. They're coming from a place of, I want to look good, I want to make you look bad, or this makes us look bad as a team. So there's so many ways that ego can get in the way from an accountable culture. And I think this is why so many people don't have an accountable culture, because they've never been taught how to create a culture of accountability that actually works. That's not, because no one wants to be in a place where it feels like the military. People are barking orders at you. They're saying, why didn't you do this? And there's all sorts of guilt and shame involved. Well, consider that it doesn't have to be that way. Although oftentimes those are the models that we see when we hear about this idea of accountability.
That's really interesting as well. We could talk a little bit about some of the symptoms that we see in architecture firms, like to help perhaps our listeners to kind of identify with themselves, like, does my team look like, or, does my organization lack a culture of accountability? And some of the things that you might recognize would be if you're getting frustrated or complaining that work doesn't get completed to the level that you wanted it to get completed to. That often happens. Missing deadlines. That's often a real good indicator of there's a lack of accountability here. Deadlines being moved around and all wishy-washy. That's again a good indicator of it. And it's also interesting that when people talk about accountability, we immediately go from one context as being overly agreeable and soft. And then the next extreme is now we're ruling our businesses with this kind of tyrannical fist, like a Steve Jobs kind of like, F you, do this, you scumbag, you've mucked up again, get out of my face kind of place. And neither of those are what we're talking about. On that said, an accountability conversation can be very assertive. Okay. If it's within a culture of accountability, it works. But if you're just using the words, let's say, in an accountability conversation, you're trying to mimic it. Okay. The being part of it, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but you're just trying to mimic an accountable culture. You're trying to mimic being a hard ass like in the military. This is when it doesn't work, and then we can be uncompassionate. Okay. We've not got the heart for it. And I think it takes a big leader as well to recognize that actually being truly compassionate has an element of being ruthless in it. A lot of the time, agreeableness masquerades as compassion, and it's not. It's just being a wimp. You're not having a meaningful conversation with somebody, and they're suffering, and you're suffering, and the business culture is suffering, and everyone's getting hurt, and then it's all got this agreeable language sprinkled on top of it to make it look, acceptable. That's what we've got to be kind of paying attention to. And there's an art as well, for sure, of holding people accountable. It doesn't need to be aggressive, or you don't need to have to use strong language, though that does have a time and a place for it. I use an example of the monastics that I work with, and there's a wonderful story about the one of the sort of older abbots of the lineage that I follow. where he was always renowned for being a very compassionate and loving monk, and had spent a lot of time cultivating this uh, deep love of humanity. But there were times where he needed to be very fierce and forceful, if you like, with his communication. Right? There are stories of something happening on a construction site within the monastery, and the monk would be very fierce in the way that he had to communicate. The same thing with when I worked at Richard Rogers. He was a very warm, generous, empowering kind of person. Well, he held people accountable within that. Like, there was a time where sometimes fierceness was appropriate. And if you've created a culture where people know how to receive fierceness, and that they know that it's like they're loved ultimately, and that they know that the fierceness is coming at them as a result of us listening to you as a leader, us listening to you as a powerful individual. They know that you've created a culture where that's the background context of it. Okay, we can receive fierce communication, because we don't always have time to get into being therapists.
Exactly. And sometimes that's called safety. So sometimes
Yes.
people use the word safety to describe an environment where people ultimately know that they're cared for, and they know that any so-called reprimand or any being held to account is coming from a place of love and concern, not only for the individual, but for the team as a whole.
Mhm.
And this is where, when we just look at the outside, this is why if let's say you hired us as consultants to come into your business and help turn your team from good into world class or high performing. If we were just to look on the surface and we were to look at the actions, we'd be missing the actual driver and the genesis of high performance. Because the genesis of high performance isn't in the doing. It's not, although the David Goggins style, rah, push yourself through, just get stuff done, there's something to say for that forward penetrating warrior energy. If it's missing the element of care and compassion behind it. In other words, if our internal state is off, if we're approaching this from a place of something's broken, it needs to be fixed. My team member's broken, they need to be fixed. You did something wrong, I don't look good. These are all the shadow sides that can enter into accountability, which frankly, again, is why very few organizations really have a good culture of accountability. And the impacts of that, one of the impacts, you already mentioned one, which was this environment of agreeableness, as you put it. Second one would be a lack of an accountable culture diminishes the status of the architect and the leadership of architects. It positions them as a supplier or a vendor, as opposed to a valued advisor or a consultant. And there's impacts of this. This means that it's harder to charge premium fees. It means that your authority, your gravitas when it comes to making decisions and leading the client along is diminished, because every single time something isn't held to account, or every single time there's a slip in accountability, just think about it this way. It's like some of the power leaks out. It's like you have an engine that's firing, and instead of all that force being put into the combustion of the engine, there's a leak. So when one of the pistons fires off, some of that force goes out into the air and doesn't end up turning the camshaft on the engine. Same thing happens in teams. And it's not just architecture firms that struggle with this. Many organizations have a lot of difficulty putting into place a culture of accountability. And so it makes capturing higher fees difficult, if not impossible. It positions us as a supplier or a vendor. It impacts the bottom line. It has very real impacts on money, because we're less efficient when we're not accountable. So I'll tell you another story, Ryan. Here's something interesting. I was talking to someone who, this lady had been a cheerleading coach for a lot of her life. And we're talking elite cheerleaders. Like, she did it with, she was a cheerleader coach for middle school age girls, so younger girls, but they were pretty intense. They would travel, they would go to different competitions. These are like little gymnasts that they would do. I mean, these are not just waving pom-poms in there, but they were real acrobats, and in the kind of cheers that she did. And it was competitive to get on this particular team. And she said she learned a crucial lesson when she discovered that she was afraid to tell 4 of the bottom performing cheerleaders that they no longer had a spot on the team because she didn't want to crush their self-esteem. She wanted, she didn't want to make them feel bad. She wanted to support them. But what she realized as she was just had this little insight, this little epiphany of realization, is that these girls who were on the team who weren't performing to the level that was required of them and the level that other team members were performing in, they actually felt bad being on the team. So they knew it. They recognized that they weren't measuring up to performance. And so they were carrying around this dissatisfied feeling of feeling like, I don't belong here. And as such, they weren't even happy in those positions. So the more compassionate thing to do, which this lady eventually did, is she just had that conversation with them. Say, look, your performance is not such that it merits results on the team. And I know that you probably feel uncomfortable being here because you feel like you don't fit in and you're not performing at the level of the other athletes. And she said that every single one of them, except for one, was relieved in that conversation. The other one was upset that she had gotten let go, but shortly thereafter, a month or two later, she recognized the wisdom of that and she was much happier in her new position. So we can see that when you don't hold people to account, we may think that we're being compassionate with them. We may believe that we're letting them have the benefit of the doubt by letting this thing slide. But what we're really doing is we're undermining the effectiveness of the entire organization. It's like they talk about the example of making your bed in the military. How you do one thing is how you do everything. If you leave your room without making your bed, that leakage may seem inconsequential, but it's not. It leaks over into every other commitment and thing that you do throughout the day. Or so the military men tell me. I haven't been in the military, but I'm going to take their word for it.
I like it. I often use some examples of Buddhist wrathful deities. Now, I might get some of this a little bit wrong, but some of those wrathful deities, they have swords and there's fire and brimstone behind them, and they're fierce-looking deities, but they're also symbols of compassion. And I really like that sort of wrathful acknowledgement of compassion, that it's not always, to be really compassionate means that we've got to take a stand for something. We've got to generally take a stand for somebody else, which means that we've got to be willing to cut through their illusion and our own illusion. Like, we've got to be willing to kind of do battle with all the niceties and agreeableness. We've got to be aware of our own insecurities and fear around being rejected in a conversation where I might hold somebody accountable. So there is something warrior about it. And it's interesting that these kind of ancient philosophical systems and systems for cultivating wisdom, have imagery that sort of reflects this something that's fierce, something that's got a high level of energy to it. And I do want to sort of have that, because I think there's a real skill to being able to do this, and what might work for one individual might not necessarily work for another one. And us as leaders, we've got to be situationally aware of who it is that we're talking to, where their level is at, what kind of, how robust we can have a conversation with them, and then lead with our heart and make sure that they're empowered at the end of it. And if they're not, then okay. Some of these conversations can be recoverable, but we've got to be sensitive to it. So it's not a kind of one size fits all type of situation. It's our emotional intelligence and ability to be situational leaders on how to communicate this. So to the idea of just being overly agreeable, and it if you're listening to this as an architecture firm, when you're being overly agreeable. And the industry as a whole has been overly agreeable. When I talk to developers, they know how agreeable architects are. They know that they can put a little bit of force onto an architect and say, we can't pay you right now because our money hasn't come through. And the architect will say, okay, no probs, don't worry, we're here to help. And then the architect is taking out loans to pay their team members, and then they never get paid, or whatever craziness that happens. Other professions know that architects are very agreeable and very kind of, I want to try and not use language like soft, but hopefully you understand what I'm trying to articulate. Right? That our own agreeableness is masquerading as something compassionate and caring. That's where
Oh, that's a very good distinction. The idea of a masquerade, right?
yeah,
We've all seen the movies of the Victorian masquerades where the people walk in there and they have the cute little masks on that cover up their eyes, and there's this element of intrigue and mystery, and you can't see them. And this is the crap that we do in leadership and organizations, where we put on the smiling face. We see ourselves as saints and compassionate people, but we're not holding people to account, which is it's a lack of compassion. We're doing it because we don't believe in the greatness of the other person. We're not willing to have conversations that may be uncomfortable in the hope of better connection and better performance.
yeah,
Not out of performance's sake, not like we're trying to wring out every last bit of money from people, but because we as human beings are committed to the best versions of ourselves and the best results for our clients,
yeah.
which is a completely different energy.
You start to realize what a schmuck a lot of us can be when we're not
Yeah, I mean, guilty as charged.
when we're not standing for somebody's leadership, somebody's greatness, and then we all just become consumed with being liked. Okay, I'm kind of putting it in quite black and white terms here. It's often a lot more sort of murky, but ultimately that's what's happening. Like, we're being a schmuck because we're scared of being rejected and holding somebody accountable. And architects, we're very good, we're very smart, so we can intellectualize and rationalize it away and, have lots of evidence for it. But ultimately, we're backing out of a conversation because we're lacking self-awareness of our own fear. And we're doing a disservice to the mental well-being and personal power of our other individual team members. That's what I mean by we're being a schmuck, because we're allowing ourselves to be enrolled in their own doubts about their capabilities. And I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want to upset anybody. Okay, and
Oh,
we're
you certainly are rocking the boat right now, Ryan. By the way, I want to define what schmuck means. I looked this up. So a schmuck, according to the Oxford Languages Dictionary, it sounds like it's a German word, but it doesn't say anything about that. It just says it's informal North American. It says a foolish or contemptible person. So we don't want to be a foolish or contemptible person.
yeah, it's being inauthentic. Okay, we're pretending to be all compassionate and nicey, and actually we're doing a massive disservice to the people in our team and to ourselves and to our vision and to our purpose and to our mission and to our profit and to our money. No, it's not something that should be, we should be very, very cognizant of this. And as business owners, as leaders of firms, that one of our priorities is to be making leadership environments like genuine safe spaces, like a safe space where you've trained your people so that they understand how to be able to be inside of a robust conversation. You've trained yourself and done the work so that you can handle robust conversations with clients, employees, and team members.
Another impact here, Ryan, and you mentioned the idea of lack of accountability being a culture or rot from the inside, an invisible rot, which is so true. The other thing that happens here that can be invisible is that lack of accountability can breed resentment, which is often an unacknowledged or invisible aspect of this. Because what happens when we know we're not living up to our potential, sort of like these cheerleaders that I talked about, we can start to blame other people around us for our underperformance. We have to take out those feelings somehow. And so that can breed resentment in the organization where we start to resent where we work because we're not being held to a high level. Because as human beings, there's something naturally within us that knows when we're not operating at our highest potential, that knows when we're dropping the ball. And I've been in that position before. I've been in positions where I knew I was underperforming, and it's so easy to start to resent the organization or start to resent the owner or start to blame them for the fact that I'm underperforming. So this resentment is what is underneath the surface. If we could peer underneath the surface of the culture, we would see all sorts of yucky muck under there. And one of those things is resentment. Another one is complaint. And they all show up through cynicism, lack of engagement, oftentimes in firms that would be very passive things that we might not notice, which at the end of the day, massively impact the bottom line, massively impact ultimately the creative output of a firm.
The other side of this, which we kind of touched on briefly as well, is being the reactive leader. So that's somebody who explodes emotionally with anger and force, and you try and force team members. And this is also quite common in architecture, practices, and is also a kind of another symptom of perhaps a low level of emotional intelligence and having not done that much personal work on yourself. But that's often, I understand it, you as a business owner, it's your name, it's your legacy, it's your reputation on the line, and then we've got a very limited palette of communication tools and color. So we end up getting triggered by somebody's lack of performance. We're not taking any responsibility for it ourselves, so we don't know how to frame or create a culture of a safe space. Okay, that's completely missing. And then you launch into a tirade against or about somebody, or worse, you might humiliate somebody in front of the rest of the group. Okay, this is now now we've just accelerated the resentment and the frustration, and you're trying to operate within a culture of fear inside of your business, and you might get limited results from it, but it's ultimately going to be exhausting for the team. There'll be high turnover. People will switch their brains off because now they're frightened of making a mistake. So they won't want to take any autonomy in decision making and do something because they're frightened of being reprimanded and punished and publicly humiliated. But again, there was no culture to be able to do that. You didn't put it in place. You've just been acting as like having a tantrum at people. And then you might color that with, oh, these entitled Gen Zers who are so mentally weak. Okay, we see that side of it as well.
So let's look at what happens when there's a culture of accountability. What happens when every single team member is moving powerfully ahead towards the mission, when people are being integrous with their commitments, when they're coming to you and holding you to account as the leader. What starts to happen in an organization where you don't feel like you're pushing every initiative forward, where you're not having to put out every fire. As a matter of fact, people are being proactive in solving these issues. It's going to have a very real impact on your contentment, your peace of mind, your financial rewards, but most importantly, your fulfillment and your joy as a leader. Because when we're dealing with having to hold people to account and people aren't living up to our expectations or their commitments, then this is a real energetic drain on us as leaders, and it ripples through everything. So on the flip side of that, when that doesn't exist, when people are pulling forward, when there is a culture of accountability where everyone is keeping everyone else accountable, think about how quickly things get done. Think about how efficiently. Think about the high quality of work that gets produced. Think about the word of mouth that happens when other contractors and owners start getting word about what this firm is up to and how they're operating. This is the best form of marketing, is a solid referral. So if you do good work, we know, hey, look, do good work and you're likely to get referrals. Well, the way to do good work is not only the work itself is good, but the delivery and the process of delivering that work is good. I've heard too many horror stories of renowned firms that do great work, and yet the process of working with them is, let's say, substandard, terrible, even cringy.
Yeah, no, we hear this a lot, and sometimes we have little insights into, talking with clients and their complaints around working with architects who are producing fantastic design work, but the experience that they've been put through is quite traumatic in some cases. Like this, feel like that nobody was communicating with them. I had a very interesting conversation the other day. Actually, I was at the Austin AIA Design for Excellence conference, and one of the firm owners that I met there, he's one of the partners of a firm, 75 people or so, and he took a little sabbatical out of architecture for a while, and he went and worked for I think it was a hospitality company that was working in and around the F1 site there in Austin. And so he went client side effectively and was involved in the hiring and working with architects. And he was saying one of the things that he found really insightful was how frustrated he got being a client with architects for not being leaders. And what he was saying was like a simple thing that, I'm paying you a lot of money to be making decisions and leading this process forward, yet you are coming to me with every last decision, overwhelming me with choices and not empowering me to help make a decision. And he was like, it was really weak and frustrating for him as a client working with an architect. And he said, I could appreciate it from the architect because they want the client to be involved, and but it's that kind of lack of accountability where nobody was leading the client. And he said when the architect was doing that to him, that it devalued their service. It was like, I don't want to be paying this kind of
Yes.
money for
Yes.
you if I'm the one that's being brought into every flipping decision. And we see this a lot with clients, and a client will suddenly then get fed up. And if you're working with high D developers, I mean, D in the disc profile sort of, they're very direct, they're focused, they're kind of results orientated kind of people, like a lot of successful entrepreneurs, business people, developers often are. And if you're being wavering in your leadership and bringing them into all sorts of decisions, they're either going to just put you into that box of being a supplier, and so you just do what I say, or they're going to take control of the project. Like really take control of it, and then you're sidelined. And again, we hear architects complaining about that all the time. So the solution is more in communication and leadership than it is systems and processes. Systems and processes are very important. Don't get me wrong. But we see firms with the best systems who are still massively inefficient and ineffective. Why? Because they lack leadership. They're not having these kind of conversations. So when we're creating an environment and us as leaders take it on to train ourselves in being communicators of accountability and to create that kind of environment, this is when we start to see team members being empowered and they start making decisions for themselves. And what's that lovely phrase you use, Enoch? I'd rather ask for forgiveness than...
Have I said that?
What Jackie was telling me yesterday. I'd rather ask for forgiveness than not take action through fear of punishment.
There we go. Yeah.
What's the phrase?
Yeah, it's great. I'm not sure what it is, but that sounds right in line. That's the concept. I don't even know if I've used that, but I'm like, I'll take it. That sounds very wise and very profound. I'm sure I've said that sometime.
Jackie, our chief of staff here, she was telling me yesterday. We were talking about how she takes action, and she's not afraid to take action. And she said that you had told her, I'd rather that get into the mindset of being willing to ask for forgiveness for taking the wrong action than not taking action because of the fear of making the wrong decision and getting punished for it.
So important. You know what's interesting about that, Ryan, is the number one criteria of success. Guess what it is? It's speed of implementation. Yeah, which goes back to decisions, right?
Yeah.
Think about that. The number one criteria of success. It's not how well you do things. It's not how smart you are. It's not even how emotionally intelligent you are. All those things are important. It's literally the speed at which you execute. And we can take these lessons, like people like Steve Jobs, people like Jeff Bezos, people like Elon Musk. They have a high level of execution. They execute quickly and they execute often. And so we can take these same lessons, we can take them back into our businesses. And Ryan, something that you mentioned, which is really great, you pointed out this example of a client being frustrated that the architect is coming to them with too many options. This is a great example of where things exist in our blind spot. So from the architect's perspective, we can think we're doing a great service, we're giving them a lot of options, we want them to have the best experience. So from our perspective, we can easily think that everything's great, that this is exactly what the client wants. A blind spot is when actually it's not that way. The client's having another experience. The client is like, I don't like this. Why do I need to be having all these choices and decisions? What am I paying these architects for? And this is why something like Smart Practice is so powerful. This is why we have an entire podcast, an entire business around the business of architecture, because business is not simply making money or getting paid or issuing invoices or profit and loss statements, but it's little things that extend into every fiber of the business. And some of these are in our blind spots, like not actually understanding where we're hurting ourselves and where we're not showing up. Like you said earlier, being agreeable as a disguise for, our own insecurity about having a crucial or challenging conversation.
Yeah, it's a masquerade. It can masquerade our fear of rejection and insecurities. Great. Number two, in terms of the possibilities, we're talking about this kind of powerful, effective, efficient, results-driven environment. Okay, on all sorts of levels, from design to client experience. The second thing that starts to emerge when we're really taking on accountability is that the architect gets to be the architect. They're the lead, as we've been talking about. They're leading the client powerfully into making decisions, paying on time, and creating their vision. You've got to be able to, as a leader here, the biggest obstacle to a client's vision is themselves. So we have to lead them out of the way of themselves. Right? That's very much the work that we're always doing, is we're helping each other get out of the way of ourselves and the vision that we have for a project or for your business. This starts to position the architect back as the master strategist, or puts them in the category of being a trusted advisor and a consultant, rather than the runaround boy or some sort of supplier where they could just get a cheap number and they're just looking at you in terms of price. This is not what we want. And again, us as an industry, we have the kind of, I'd make the assertion that a lot of outside perspectives view us as a sort of necessary evil that projects need. And of course, there are the sort of enlightened clients, if you like, where they've experienced good architects, they've worked with leaders, and they really see an architect as being a trusted advisor and a strategist that helps them get to where they want to go and accomplish their vision. But again, us being leaders and not shying away from these accountability conversations is the kind of transformation that we can have.
To have an accountable organization where everything's firing on all cylinders, there's a certain number of mindsets that need to be adopted. And one of these mindsets is the idea, the principle that collision creates. Collision causes creation. So just a quick example, up here in the Sierra Nevada mountains where I live, when there's forest fires, we may think of a forest fire as being something bad. And yet we know that the Forest Service manages the forest by controlled burns, because when the forest gets out of control, in other words, when there's too much dead wood on the ground because they've suppressed the fires, this is when these massive fires happen that end up creating massive ecological disasters. So oftentimes we avoid collision, or we avoid things that we might think are conflict, because we want to keep the peace. So this is another masquerade that we have. Well, I just want to keep the peace. I don't want to have any tempers flare up. I don't want to have any sort of collision. And what we don't recognize is it is that collision. It is those direct conversations that actually lead to not only creation, but actually connection. Because if an employee is not living up to their end of the bargain, they continue to miss deadlines, and don't hold them to account. What they experience from their side is probably an element of permissiveness. And then again, as we mentioned earlier, it's very easy for them to start to resent the experience, because they're literally feeling bad that they continue to miss these deadlines. And I guarantee they're probably not taking full ownership of it. And so guess what? They're blaming you that they missed these deadlines. And that's what creates a toxic culture, or at least leads to it.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, this idea of, kind of us starting to embrace these collision conversations as a context or a ground for creation, that in a practical sense, we can start practicing collision conversations everywhere. So, for example, start disagreeing with somebody. Okay, say, no, actually, I don't think that, in a conversation. Or in a restaurant, this is one for the Brits, because I think the Americans are much better at this. If you're in a restaurant and they bring out your food or your cup of coffee and it's not to your liking, send it back. Okay, those are those little points where normally we might go, we'll rationalize it. Oh, I don't want to cause a scene. I don't want to have a trouble, etc., etc. But they become quite good moments for us to practice this idea of collision, and for us to get comfortable with it as like it's okay. And you can create something there. You can create affection or support with your waiter. You don't have to be a bell end about it, where you're just like, send this coffee back. Practice on all of it. You can acknowledge them and appreciate them for doing this. Thank you so much for bringing this coffee. I hate to be a pain in the ass, but I'm going to have to ask if I can send this back, because it's really not to my liking.
Ryan, again, fantastic insights around accountability. And I love how we're able to dive into how important this is for organizations. How oftentimes we're not even recognizing the damage that's done in our organization because of the lack of an accountable culture and how we were never taught that as architects. And this is why it's so important as leaders, if we're running a firm, to invest in ourselves, because these kind of investments in ourselves pay dividends.
So I had this, we're renovating our apartment in New York, which you know about. I've shared that with you many a time. And we had a very talented electrician, lighting installer gentleman that came in, and he worked his ass off putting together and installing a number of LED lights, in, hidden away in various roof beams. And I walked into the room and noticed that all of them the lenses were on backwards. And normally you could probably slide the lens out and just turn it around and it wouldn't be an issue. But the way that there was quite a tight installation meant that all of it had to be done. And part of me, I had this resistance. I was like, no, just leave it. No one's going to notice. It's not that big of a deal. I thought, no, there's absolutely not. We can't do this. And so the conversation was just structured in a way, and we'll talk about the framework a little bit later. But first of all, acknowledging all of his hard work, then taking on some of the blame. You're probably going to hate me for this, and I know this might appear to be really pernickety. However, these lights are installed backwards. And he didn't quite believe it at first. I showed him a diagram, understood, and then there was an instruction. You reckon you can finish that off today? Okay. And so it was an awkward conversation, but there was friction there, and there was a part of me that wanted not to have to tell him to do it again. However, it would have been out of integrity for both of us. And he was also the kind of person that we want on a building site, where he was really committed to getting things right and executing it the way that we wanted to get it executed. So I'm sure many of our listeners here have had that a similar sort of experience where, you're holding builders accountable. You're holding them, you're saying that's not what was on the drawings. That's not what we had agreed upon. And the avoidance of those conversations leaves us with a much lower quality product. So going back to some of these possibilities, we've spoken about when we've got a culture of accountability and we've trained ourselves in having these conversations, we can actually produce a team that is resilient. They have mental fortitude, there's passion, fire, commitment, and most importantly, compassion. We're able to lead with compassion with each other, and we have a situational awareness of when to, what kind of communication is appropriate. And also this ends up creating a powerful ecosystem where everything else is supporting everything else. So some of the principles that we just mentioned, Enoch was talking about, collision leads to creation. And I would also like to add one as well, where we talk about that your integrity and accountability, your own personal integrity and your own personal ability to be held accountable is mirrored in your team. So if being held accountable to you starts to feel like a drag, or you feel like you're a little kid at school being told off, then we're going to have this resistance to holding other people accountable. And accountability as leaders really does start with us. Like, it's our environment. I'm 100% responsible for all the results that the business does. And, we're not into the business of, let me take 50% of accountability and you take 50% of accountability. No, I'm taking 100% accountability for what's happened. And then the other person is also taking 100% responsibility and accountability for what happened. Okay. That is different from 50-50. Okay. 50-50, we're still sort of blaming each other. 100% is where we can meet as leaders and have accountability. So our own personal ability to be held accountable and to do the mental work where we can remain in a powerful frame about accountability, i.e., I'm able to disassociate from my anger or reaction to it. I can understand that I feel like being a child might be some unprocessed human stuff that I might need to go sit down and work out. But it's worth it. It's worth developing your ability to be in a powerful frame when being held accountable and even look for it. Okay, we want to get feedback. I want to be able to see where my blind spots are. I'm happy to be shown my blind spots, even if it makes me look foolish or look silly or there's a bit of pride that gets injured in the way. Okay, being a leader really does demand of us an extraordinary amount of humility. Your team will pick up on this, and that's what we want them to mirror, is our own ability to be held accountable. The frame of accountability, again, this is holding accountability in a powerful context within our firms. So it means that we've created this safe space that we've been talking about, where accountability is something which is a facilitator to you stepping into your leadership. This is the frame. We're going to hold you accountable because you are a leader. I'm holding you accountable because I'm listening to you and interacting with you as a leader. Okay, I'm interacting with you as the highest version of yourself. And leaders have a particular way of talking with each other where that's the frame. I know that when somebody is holding me accountable, that it's because they're listening to me as a leader, because they see great things inside of me. Okay, that's a really beautiful frame for us to be having with our team members. And you can even tell them this, right? That's the intention, that the reason why I'm holding you accountable here and I'm demanding stuff from you is because I see that you're brilliant. I see you're a leader. Okay. You know that you have that potential to do it. Okay. But there's stuff getting in the way here. But I'm holding you in that space of leadership. Okay. So that's a powerful frame. So a framework for us to use in these collision-based conversations, I'll kind of map out here before we conclude. Number one is to be aware of your own frustrations and complaints. So a level of personal self-awareness is crucial to being a leader. You have to be able to distinguish between your narrative around events and what you've invented and created and your own upset and frustrations and misery that you're interpreting, okay, versus the facts of a situation. So self-awareness, being able to observe your own thinking, to be able to observe and have an awareness of the way that you interpret things and recognize that your interpretation may not be reality. You can start recognizing that my interpretation may not be real and that it's based on emotions and I've gotten carried away with my own feelings. That becomes a very important mental faculty to develop. Okay, so being aware of your own frustrations, your own complaints. We often use the language from Werner Erhard of rackets is a really great description of these persistent complaints that perpetuate themselves, and we kind of interact with them as being reality, or being aware of your own filters over situations. Okay, again, this is deep and there are blind spots. This is why working with a coach, working with other leaders, because other leaders are going to point your frustrations and complaints out to you, and you might be very attached to them and not believe them. But it's incredibly important that we cultivate and strive to be perpetually aware of our own filters and narratives, particularly when they're distorting the facts and or it's creating a disempowering situation. Okay, one where you're reactive. Second is to be authentic, right? So really tune into your intuition and leading with love and compassion and heart, and really ground yourself in when you're about to have one of these conversations. What do you want? What's the most loving outcome that you want for you and the other person? What's the most loving and empowering outcome for both you people in terms of your own long-term well-being and mental fortitude and personal power? Okay. Now I want to put that in terms of the long-term mental fortitude, because if we just focus on the immediate scenario, then you'll be reticent or hesitant to have an awkward conversation, or your fear of rejection might kind of stop you from engaging like that. Okay. So be authentic. Number 3 is be affirmative. So this might be clarifying what the purpose of this conversation is for with the other person. So I've just mentioned there that you relay the intentions as being one of seeing them as a leader, but you also want to clarify what this meeting is not about. Okay, so for example, Enoch is very good at this. He'll reprimand somebody, or he'll kind of hold someone accountable, and will make the statement, when I'm having this conversation, because I'm standing for your vision of you, I'm standing for your excellence, your leadership. What this is not is a punishment. What this is not is me trying to publicly humiliate you or reprimand you in front of anybody else. What this is not is me belittling you or criticizing or judging you as an individual. Okay, so sometimes we use this as a kind of contrasting statements, but we're being affirmative over what the intention is of the conversation and what the intention is not over the conversation. Then we can move into the next phase of getting complete. So we can talk about the facts. We can talk about what actually happened, the what so. We can lay all these things out on the table. We can invite each other to be looking at it from multiple perspectives. And that allows us to start getting complete and have a healthy conversation. You as a leader, it's great when you've got facts, because we can be a slightly more objective here about here's what this and this happened. This and this happened on these dates. Great. Just sets a objective tone, and you've already done the work of separating the individual from their behavior. And then finally, then we can create something. Now we've laid the foundation for co-creating something new, a powerful relationship with your team member to produce excellent results. We had a client recently who had been trained in this framework for holding these collision conversations, and they had a team member who they had some issues with. Team member was a high D, and they'd been avoiding the conversation. Okay, so the high D on the disc profile personality perhaps was a bit curt, sometimes came across a bit rude, sometimes became a little bit combative in communication, and it was causing some friction inside of the firm. And the two partners were wanting to speak to this person about it, and had spoken around it, but had never addressed it directly, and nor had addressed what the impacts were. The conversation kind of came up organically, and one of the partners were talking about, things that weren't working in the firm, and the sort of younger leader expressed that they felt that they were sidelined because they didn't have a shareholder stake in the firm, and was asking whether that was a possibility. And that was a great sort of opening. It was a good indication as well that the conversation was in a safe space for someone to be able to share that sort of openly and honestly about what was getting in the way. And one of the partners was like, yeah, this definitely could be a possibility. And one of the other ones was just authentic. Actually, no, for me, I've got my reservations. And then proceeded to talk about their reservations. And it was a very short and quick conversation, but it was very powerful in the sense that it was just authentic. It was real. There was facts that were involved. There had been a context created where people were, there was that safety that we've been talking about. We're standing and listening to you as fellow leaders. That doesn't mean that you're entitled to get something or have that kind of reward straight out of the gate. And it just provided a context for powerfully communicating where the reservations were. And they shared with us earlier about how within the space of 2 to 3 minutes, it was like one of the most honest and real conversations that they'd had in the firm. And that's a great foundation for building leaders and leaderships in your organization. When the company, you and your organization are able to speak the unspoken, able to share things, and you're able to hold people accountable and talk about performance without being reactivated, this is when we can start producing extraordinary results. And we can start cultivating like real deep levels of compassion and leadership in ourselves.
That is a wrap. And here is today's Smart Practice Tool Tip. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever accepted scope creep as part of the business? If you have, you're not alone. Oftentimes we don't really understand that this is the biggest area in which architectural practices are losing and leaking money. And the worst part about it is it's not even that it's money that's someone else's money. It's money that you have already banked on. You've set the contract for this amount and it's just leaking right out the back door. So what happens here is it's not just part of the business. This is a firm-wide failure of clarity, consistency, and leadership. It's not uncommon. So if you're dealing with scope creep, you're not the only one. The good news is it is easier to remedy than you may think. And it's the easy, comparatively, compared to some of the other strategies, to be able to add an extra $10,000, $50,000, $100,000 every single year to your bottom line. So the question I ask you right now is, could you use an extra $20,000 this year? If you could, the Scope Creep First Aid Kit will give you practical tools like client-ready email templates and coaching guides for your teams, so scope control isn't left to guesswork or gut feelings. Once you implement this with your team, they can confidently protect and manage your margins for you. This is what we mean when we say smart practice. You can get this tool completely free by going to businessafarchitecture.com/creep. And now a word from today's sponsors, Gelt and World Teams.
Today's episode is sponsored by Gelt. Is your architecture firm just filing taxes or actually using them to grow the business? Gelt is your partner in optimizing your taxes so you can focus on scale. They work with you year-round, not just at tax time, taking a proactive approach that combines expert CPAs and powerful technology, from smart entity structures to overlooked deductions and smarter compensation planning. Gelt helps architecture firms unlock strategies most accountants miss. And exclusively for Business of Architecture listeners, Gelt is offering 10% off your first year. Don't wait for next tax season. Schedule your complimentary consultation at joingelt.com. That's joingelt.com to learn more and mention BOA when you sign up. A while ago, we began to hear reports of a company that was helping some of our clients build remote teams. We looked into it more closely and discovered the company World Teams that was helping small architectural practitioners build remote teams that were both capable and qualified. We were intrigued by another business that are addressing one of the critical pain points for small architectural practices, which is the ability to grow and shrink a team effectively, to be able to handle higher workflow without having to staff up significantly, and also being very sensitive about labor cost. World Teams is built to address these issues. World Teams is a small but mighty company that helps architectural practices build high-performing remote teams quickly and efficiently, saving you the headache of sorting resumes and interviewing underqualified candidates. World Teams operates in your time zone and prioritizes near-native English speakers, ensuring clear and efficient communication with your remote team members. They have flexible contracts so you can adjust your team size as your needs evolve. Additionally, you're connected directly with your skilled professionals, which fosters trust and collaboration, and World Teams helps you reduce your operating cost without compromising the quality that's so important to a practice. To download a free guide for building a remote team for a small architectural practice, go to businessafarchitecture.com/World Teams. That's one word, businessafarchitecture.com/World Teams.
As always, thanks to our sponsors, and thank you to those of you who left a review on iTunes. When you leave a review, it helps other people find the Business of Architecture podcast, which actually creates a tide that raises all boats. To be acknowledged on the show, I'd love to read your name out. Here's the steps. Just open up the podcast app on your iPhone, search for Business of Architecture. When you see that, scroll all the way after you click on the show, and at the bottom, you'll have a place to leave a review. As a reminder, Smart Practice is the step-by-step process, framework, and collection of systems that we've developed over the past decade here at Business of Architecture to help you as a small practice owner go from chaos to calm. So, unless you hate money, unless you hate efficiency, unless you hate doing fantastic designs, then don't go to this following website, smartpracticemethod.com. Because you see, it likely isn't your architecture skills that hold you back. It may be the business aspects of running a practice. And on that page, smartpracticemethod.com, you'll discover the Smart Practice Method system and the 4 key pillars to allowing yourself to go from chaos to calm. So with that, I wish you carpe diem and goodbye for now. And as a reminder, the views expressed on the show by any of our guests do not represent those of the host, and we make no representation, promise, guarantee, pledge, warranty, contract, bond, or commitment except to help you be your best architect. Carpe diem.